Today, we're digging into one of the most difficult and most important debates in all of American history. We're going to use historical sources to really explore the U.S. Constitution and its deep, incredibly complicated relationship with slavery.
So let's just get right to it. The central question is a heavy one, and it's something historians and legal scholars have wrestled with for centuries. Was the actual blueprint for American government intentionally built to protect the institution of slavery, or was it something else? And to understand just how high the stakes are, you don't have to look any further than the abolitionist movement itself. On one side, you've got William Lloyd Garrison, who famously burned a copy of the Constitution, calling it a covenant with death. But on the other side, you have Frederick Douglass, who, after at first agreeing with Garrison, later came to believe that the document's own principles could actually be used as a weapon for emancipation. I mean, think about that. Two giants of the movement with two completely opposite views of the exact same text. So let's explore the evidence behind this really fundamental contradiction. We're going to look at the men and the motivations that shaped this document from the very beginning. To make this all feel a bit more tangible, we're going to zoom in on one of the most powerful voices at the Constitutional Convention. Because if we can understand his perspective, we can start to see how these abstract debates about law and liberty were actually grounded in some very specific and very personal interests.
So, meet John Rutledge. He was a wealthy lawyer, a plantation owner, and an absolute political heavyweight from South Carolina. And the historical sources are pretty clear. To really understand the compromises on slavery, you have to understand men like him. And make no mistake, this guy was a force to be reckoned with. Rutledge wasn't some fringe character. He was right at the center of power. He'd been a delegate to the earliest Congresses, he served as his state's governor, and he even commanded its military. When John Rutledge spoke, people listened.
This quote, wow, it gives us such a powerful window into his character. So, during the defense of Charleston back in 1776, a general advises him to retreat. Rutledge's response? He basically says he would rather cut off his own hand. He was defiant, he was resolute, and he was absolutely committed to defending South Carolina's interests, as he saw them.
So what exactly were those interests? Well, this number really says it all. In 1790, a staggering 43% of the population in Rutledge's state was enslaved. For him and for the delegates he represented, the economy, the social structure, their entire way of life, it was completely inseparable from the institution of slavery. So, in his mind, protecting South Carolina meant protecting slavery.
Okay, so let's shift to the convention itself and see how this all played out. Rutledge was not alone. He and the other Southern delegates showed up in Philadelphia with a really clear, non-negotiable agenda. And that set the stage for some intense debates and, in the end, some really crucial compromises.
His fellow South Carolinian General Pinckney just laid it out there plain as day. They believed the whole point of government was to protect property. And to them, enslaved people were the most valuable form of property they had. Any new government, from their perspective, had to secure it. Period. No debate.
And here's the other side of that deal. This quote from Pennsylvania's James Wilson is just fascinating. He's basically admitting he can't logically defend the 3/5 clause. You know, the one that counted enslaved people for representation. But he supports it anyway. Why? Because of what he calls the necessity of compromise. For so many Northern delegates, the desire to form a new country simply outweighed their moral objections. Now, this is a crucial point. These weren't just informal handshake deals. Analysis from scholars like Paul Finkelman and Gabriel Chin shows they were written directly into the very fabric of the Constitution, creating multiple, specific protections for slavery. So let's break those down. The sources point to 6 key protections. First, the famous 3/5 clause, which gave the South way more political power. Second, a clause that protected the international slave trade for at least another 20 years. Third and fourth, you had clauses that gave the federal government power to put down slave rebellions. Fifth, the Fugitive Slave Clause, which forced free states to return escapees. And finally, some of these protections were made unamendable, literally locking them into place. And this really highlights the careful, deliberate language the framers used. The words slave or slavery, they never actually appear in the original text. As North Carolina Delegate James Iredell explained, this wasn't an accident. It was an intentional choice to use euphemisms like other persons to make the document more palatable, all without changing its real substance. The Three-Fifths Clause itself just perfectly captures this deep contradiction. Opponents were asking, look, if enslaved people are counted as persons for representation, then why aren't they citizens with rights? But if they're property, then why aren't we counting other property like horses or land? The compromise didn't solve this question at all. It just kicked the can down the road for political gain. And the consequences of this were just massive. I mean, here's James Madison, the so-called father of the Constitution, and he's rejecting a direct popular vote for president. Why? Precisely because it would weaken the extra power that slave states got from the Three-Fifths Compromise. It's a key piece of evidence in the argument that this was the pro-slavery origin of the Electoral College. Now, the Fugitive Slave Clause, this was uniquely powerful. It was the only provision that actually reached into free states and forced their citizens and their governments to actively participate in slavery by returning people who had escaped to freedom. It essentially nationalized the enforcement of slave owners' property rights. And all of this brings us to the final and maybe the most devastating argument that these sources present, that the Constitution didn't just protect slavery, it locked it into place, making a peaceful, legal end to the institution pretty much impossible. Here's the core idea. To amend the Constitution, you need a supermajority of states to agree, 3/4 to be exact. Well, the way the framers designed the whole system, the slave states would always have enough votes to block any amendment that threatened what they called their peculiar institution. This chart just lays out the cold, hard math. By 1860, there were 15 slave states. In a union of 34 states, you only needed 9 to block an amendment. The South had 15. They had a permanent veto with votes to spare. According to this analysis, there was simply no constitutional path to get rid of slavery. And the Southern founders knew it. They went back home and practically bragged about their success. Here's Pinckney again, reassuring his state that they had created a federal government that was powerless to touch slavery. It wasn't some accident, it was the entire point of their negotiations. And for many, this is the most shocking piece of evidence of all. This is Abraham Lincoln, on the very eve of the Civil War, stating plainly that, under the Constitution as it was written, he believed he had no legal right to end slavery. Even the man who would later sign the Emancipation Proclamation felt his hands were tied by the Constitution's original framework. So we end on a really difficult question. If the Constitution really was this unbreakable lock, what did it finally take to shatter it? Well, the answer wasn't a debate, or a new law, or a court case. It was a war that would ultimately pave the way for the amendments that finally remade the nation and the reinterpretation of liberty that Frederick Douglass would later champion.